So thank you everyone for joining us today. A very warm welcome to today's webinar um, to talk about our building bridges for positive impact and long-term profitability. I'm Sara. I'm the Growth and Client Success Manager at Positive Luxury, specializing in the fashion industry and closely working with our luxury fashion clients. I'll be your moderator for the next around 45-ish minutes. We'll see how we do. And today's session really has been designed based on the 2025 Global Fashion Summit hosted by the Global Fashion Agenda in Copenhagen last week. So we'll be turning some of the key themes from last week into some practical takeaways and insights. So thank you very much for joining us today. Firstly, let's have a quick look at our agenda. So we are joined by two incredible speakers who bring a wide range of expertise across supply chain transparency, biodiversity, and circularity. So we'll start with some quick introductions, and then I will give a brief overview of some of the key themes that were discussed during the Global Fashion Summit in Copenhagen last week. From there, we'll kind of go to the main section of the webinar, a panel discussion between Jolanda and Amy, and then we'll focus on three key challenges from scaling circularity, climate and nature, and policy pressure. And then we'll end with a bit of a chat between kind of collaboration versus competition. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A chat for us so that we can hopefully have some time at the end to look at these together as well. So first of all, thank you so much, Jolanda and Amy, for joining us today on this webinar. I'll give a kind of brief introduction to Jolanda. So Jolanda has over 20 years of experience in textile development, production, and supply chain management. Now she's the CEO and co-founder of tex.tracer. I will let her explain more about this, but essentially tex.tracer helps brands unlock supply chain transparency through innovative tech, empowering the fashion industry to make smarter and more sustainable decisions. And then we've also got Amy here today. Amy is a strategist, researcher, and writer focused on sustainability, climate, and nature. She advises NGOs, think tanks, and startups across energy, tech, and fashion. And she's also the founder of Sustainable and Social, which is a platform simplifying climate issues for a millennial audience. So before kind of going into the themes as well, just very quickly for anyone who might be new with Positive Luxury, just to give a bit of background, we are a sustainability consultancy that works within the luxury industry across 6 different sectors, but we have a very big focus on the fashion industry. And essentially, we help businesses understand their sustainability performance and provide them with advisory and tools to improve their sustainability practices across ESG. So being at the Global Fashion Summit last week was definitely a highlight event for the year for us. And I'm kind of looking forward to using this time today to chat about that. So let's begin by looking at some of those key insights from the summit this year. So although the industry is definitely facing uncertain times, a few standout themes emerge across different panels and breakout sessions. The first one being energy transition needs to be fair and fast. So the shift to renewable energy is still very much urgent, but it is not just about carbon. It's about making sure the whole supply chain transitions in an equitable way, especially where the climate risk is highest. Second one kind of being circularity, of course, a big one. So although it's still a challenge, we are seeing brands move from ideas to action, from investing in infrastructure, tracking progress with better metrics, to scaling recycled materials through global collaboration. And speaking of materials, of course, material innovation continues to accelerate. So breakthroughs in fiber-to-fiber recycling and the development of bio-based materials show that it is possible to scale low-impact alternatives without compromising quality. Then one that I kind of wanted to point out personally as well is that resale is here to stay. So I thought it was interesting that last year we saw very much the rental market being a very kind of big and trendy topic. But this year it was great to hear how the secondhand market is evolving fast. It's, of course, already a big cultural movement, but it's also now a solid business model. So there's a lot of tech making the experience a lot smoother and more scalable. And finally, I do need to mention that legislation is still coming. So, although there has been a lot of uncertainty in the air about legislation, it was still definitely a key theme at GFS last week. The uncertainty of legislation was addressed by brands themselves, but also the EU Parliament. But even with the tension, the message was still to encourage brands to prioritize legislation and their business operations. So once we've kind of got that out of the way in terms of snapshots, I'm happy to now kind of start the panel discussion and start with our first topic. So it's a topic that almost every brand talks about, of course, but very few have actually scaled. So that's circularity. What we heard at GFS is that circularity needs more than good intentions. And we definitely saw a lot of panels focusing on circularity at GFS, from building the right infrastructure and partnerships to scaling recycled materials. We really saw how tech and innovation are pushing material development forward, turning waste into high performance fibers. And across the board, enabling circularity means also shifting mindsets. So circularity is obviously not just about recycling, it's about fundamentally redesigning systems, from product design and sourcing to end-of-life infrastructure. How do we scale circular solutions that are financially and operationally viable? And I think this is now a perfect opportunity for me to stop talking and give Jolanda the first question. As founder of tex.tracer, whose work on traceability is helping brands unlock the real potential of circular systems. So Jolanda, transparency is really the basis of circularity, and it's also one of the hardest things to scale. So in your experience with tex.tracer, where do you see the biggest roadblocks and how are your clients overcoming them?
Yeah, well, first of all, Sarah, thanks, of course, for your question, and thanks for having me here. Wonderful to have this conversation, and a wonderful question, because indeed, you mentioned prior to this question already, like, data. First of all, data is very important, I think. Many confirmed that as well during Global Fashion Summit, talking about data is the new oil or the new gold. So if you know that data is becoming more and more important, it's important to start data collection at an early stage. So that's really starting from the design stage and making sure that data throughout the product development, production, and sales process is all connected. Then talking about product data, even though you may, as a company, not have all that data in one platform, I think it's very much about integrating all that information, integrating those platforms. And then you will see that often there is quite a bit of information on product level. The only difficult part that is not there is proper supply chain data. As in, brands have connection with their contractual supplier, but what's happening beyond that? If you have a nominated fabric supplier, then yes, indeed, you may know at least the name, but often you will see that that's a trader. And that's exactly where we see the biggest roadblock, is that clients of us, brands and retailers, actually do not have access to suppliers. So that's where we come in to help them to onboard these suppliers, so that brands and retailers can start the dialogue with them. And now let that be quite a tedious job, let's be honest. These days we're all talking about AI and how easy it's going to be to, find data and work with data, but data which is not really there. For that data, you cannot use AI. So it is really about connecting with those suppliers. Mm-hmm. And that's a very tedious job. Having said that, that's where we come in to make that a more easy job by automating the process, and very much a focus on suppliers to create an easy to use platform and make it really clear for them, like what's in it for them, so they understand where the benefit is, and this can also help them to future-proof their business.
Yeah, Definitely. Thank you for that. And I'll jump straight away from that to you, Amy, kind of from a maybe a bit of a broader perspective. So I'd love to understand your view where circularity fits, yeah, in the broader sustainability strategy, and especially from kind of working cross-sector organizations. How should brands balance the idealism of circularity with the practicality of business operations, and what mindset shifts do you think they're still missing? Kind of what Yolanda was also alluring to. Oh, I think you might be on mute. Can't hear you yet. No, we can't. Do you want to try to um no. Okay, I think we've lost Amy for a little bit, but that's okay. We'll get back to her as well. What I can kind of
I'm back. Okay,
Oh,
thanks
she's back.
everyone. I basically didn't have the authority to unmute myself, so
Oh,
thanks so
sorry.
much. No worries. That I didn't have the controls. Thanks so much for bearing with me. It's lovely to be with you all. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Yolanda and Sarah. When it comes to talking about like the practicality and like mindset shifts, I think there's a few things we can delve into here. So, firstly, thinking about integrating this into business operations through incentives and governance mechanisms, I think that's a great way to spur real like shifts in circularity that are meaningful. So whether that's specific KPIs related to team goals, and be that whether that's the design team, supply chain team, thinking about logistics as well. I know that another interesting example is a number of fashion organizations, brands, and retailers of different sizes have linked their green bonds and sustainability linked bonds to circular incentives as well. So tying specific circularity targets on materials to their debt. And I think that's a really interesting example. And I know organizations like H&M Group and Burberry have reported on this, and they are very strong on their circularity performance. So going to highlight those examples. I think another thing when it comes to like mindset shifts and practicality is the transparency around the amount invested. I think this is really, really important as well. We obviously know, I mean, GFS is an example, but there's a lot of rhetoric around circularity, but who's actually putting money where their mouth is, so to speak? I would like to call out a few different examples. So the Danish company Bestseller, in their latest sustainability report, has actually disclosed the amount they've invested in 8 next gen fiber companies as well. So I think that's really interesting example. So you can kind of track that in relation to their profits and their revenue. H&M has also been very specific and very clear and ambitious in the amount that it invested in Sara a few years ago as well, the textile to textile recycling company, and helping actually scale the infrastructure there. So I really love having tangible numbers, and I think that's an important mindset to have, is being transparent about these things. Bringing it back to last week as well at the Global Fashion Summit. Now, it wasn't a panel on circularity, but it was the session on regenerative systems. And Beth Jensen actually proposed, and what I really loved as well, is like, let's extend the definition of circularity. Like, we know, Sarah, as you said at the beginning, it isn't just about recycled materials, it's about regenerative systems, renewable materials. And I think that's a really important fundamental mindset shift that the industry needs to have as well. And then I guess the other thing is perhaps not mindset shift for brands and retailers, but for us as citizens or consumers, is to be able to decipher what's meaningful from what might be, as changing markets have dubbed it before, like circularity washing. So maybe I would call out an example from Shane. They a few years ago invested 200 million euros into a circularity fund, and have recently invested in working with a university on a recycled polyester process. But does that really abate the impacts of their use of petroleum fibers? So that's a mindset for us to think about as well as citizens, is to be critical when we're looking at how circularity is accelerating across the industry.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was one of the statements that also stood out to me at GFS, is that circularity is not inherently sustainable. It's something that we kind of straight away think about, oh, it's circular, or they're doing a circularity project, great. But what does it actually mean? And I think it's a really powerful reminder that it doesn't automatically equal to positive impact. At Positive Luxury, we of course assess circularity when we work with brands, but not just as a design principle. We also look at it as a kind of system level KPI. So like both of you were talking about numbers and data, it's all interconnected. If brands can't measure it, they can't scale it either. And that's where kind of transparency is definitely key. So that's where Jolanda, your work is so key, to understand what's going on, and then being able to put those numbers and strategies to it, so we can somehow measure it and understand, is it sustainable? Is it actually helping us?
Exactly. Avoiding people working with indicative data, thinking that they actually act based on facts, whereas they actually don't. We see that a lot, unfortunately. And I think it's important for companies to understand that it's really about starting with the right data, so that you take decisions based on real facts and factual data that is reliable.
Yeah.
Whatever way you get it, but make sure that you have the right information.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. So I will kind of move forward to our next topic. So turning to a topic that also really stood out at the summit, that's biodiversity and nature. And kind of, I feel like for too long, nature has been the blind spot in climate strategies. But we can finally kind of see that that's changing. We also saw very many panels focusing on climate and nature at GFS. One of them, Amy, you moderated, I think yourself, from farm to fashion. And yeah, these panels, all of them highlighted how fashion's impact on ecosystems really must be part of the sustainability conversation, and how regenerative strategies can be both brand building, but also kind of planet protecting. So moving to the questions. So Amy, I'm going to start with you now. You've done a lot of research on the intersection of fashion and biodiversity, and you've written powerfully about biodiversity being the next frontier of sustainability. But many fashion professionals still don't exactly know how to translate that into action. Difficult questions, but what would you say are the kind of 2 to 3 immediate things brands can do to become more nature positive?
Of course. Well, I love this question, and I think it's so exciting to watch fashion's adoption and like integration of biodiversity into climate strategy a bit more, instead of just having a paragraph or two in a sustainability report. It's becoming like a whole section in itself with meaningful targets. So I think there's so much opportunity here. I would say, in terms of the most immediate things, of course, it sounds really basic, but it is mapping your full supply chain all the way down to tier 4 to understand impacts, and engaging with farmers at that raw material, and like, you know, whether it's cotton growing or whatever it might be, at that stage, to really understand like what's going on, what practices they're doing. Because looking specifically at the wool industry as well, like actually lots of these farmers are already practicing regeneratively and doing nature positive things. They might just not realize it, and they might not be talking about it. So I think that's a really interesting and important dialogue to have with the farmers. I know at the Global Fashion Summit, in the regenerative session, they had a 7th generation wool farmer, Brett Walker. So really interesting to hear his perspectives, and always bringing the voice of the farmer into things. Another priority would be not just measuring impact, but also dependencies on natural capital as well, and reporting on that. I think that's really critical. Also incorporating water into that part of the reporting. looking as well, perhaps, and learning lessons from across different sectors. There are so many brilliant organizations that are really like working on the granular level of detail on this to help understand like value chain impact. So there's organizations like NatCap and Nature Metrics who are working a lot with food and agriculture industries as well, using lots of science, like crazy science that goes a bit above my head to understand across all these different indicators. But, you know, learning from other sectors, looking at the different solutions that are out there is another one. I also think just as a priority is getting to grips with the most important metrics. Jolanda spotlighted the importance of data. So thinking about that as a recommendation for those on this call, I would definitely say take a look at the World Benchmarking Alliance Nature Benchmark, which they published last year, and it was across different sectors, but they did a specific spotlight on apparel and footwear brands. I think there were 66 in total, but it's really interesting to see who is doing it, and also who is doing it well, are measuring things like soil health, water quality, ecosystem conservation and restoration. Are they reporting on how they're protecting key species or the recognition of Indigenous people's rights? So some really important things to consider within the nature positive sphere that aren't just related to sort of like environmental data points as well. And then I would also say look to some of the amazing regenerative and agroforestry projects that are being done. They are actually partnered with an organization called Far Farm, and they developed a project in the Amazon to encourage families to plant agroforestry in deforested areas. Wasn't about producing any more product or anything like that, just like a really important social project. And so I think thinking outside the box as well with things like that is really good. And I know we spoke about it the other day as well, but there's recently been the launch of a new book on becoming nature positive, written by really brilliant thinkers in this space. So a few ideas there for you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Amy. That's lots of different resources. I hope people wrote that down. We have also a recording of this session afterwards, so we'll be able to share that with you, because that's very helpful. And I think, yeah, super important to think outside the box. I think in the fashion industry can sometimes be especially kind of stuck to traditional ways. So I think it's really exciting to see all of these new resources come to life. But then, Jolanda, from your perspective, from kind of with tex.tracer, really focusing on that product level data, are you seeing increased demand for tracking nature-related impacts? Are there kind of some brands that are forward-thinking how to connect climate and nature data into their traceability systems?
Yeah, well, absolutely. They do. And first of all, of course, ditto what Amy just mentioned. Super interesting stuff which is happening here. And maybe just another point to do some research on as well, as we're talking a lot about the Green Deal, but now there's more talk about the Blue Deal as well. How can we make sure that water and other aspects can be taken into consideration as well? I think that's an interesting one. And then if we indeed move to the more practical side of things, from what I'm seeing is indeed more and more of our customers, brands and retailers, are looking at basically their emissions. Often that's water and CO2. And luckily we see front runners that go beyond that and say, okay, we want to understand what's happening in terms of land use, biodiversity. And those are often actually the first 2 points that they consider after water and energy, CO2. And we're happy to see that taking place, so that these forward-thinking brands are indeed taking the next step. But an important part there, I guess, is also there's no one size fits all, as in it's really, again, coming back to the idea of make sure that you have your data. And I always tell people, if you don't, I think it's very helpful to have a platform to help you. But if you're a smaller business or do it differently, I've got my Excel files still, more than happy to share those. And just at least make sure that you get started and work with your supply chain to understand where your biggest emissions are and also what your impact on nature is. And then you can decide, if we're doing a lot in cotton, then of course that will be your your focus. And with wool, you have a completely different kind of focus points. So make sure that you individualize your approach. And it's still early days, but we're starting the first pilots with adding geospatial data, where we can really see what's happening and what the involvement of, for instance, cotton farms is. And that we can really see what is the impact on nature, so on land use and biodiversity. So looking forward to what's coming up, and helped by AI, we will see really things happening in the next few years. A lot is going to change. So I'm super excited and looking forward to work with front runners, but also then maybe also making that point, like, okay, yes, it's of course you always have front runners. At the same time, I'd really like to, we'll cross part of regulations in a bit as well, but like to also bring into the mindset for companies that avoid trying to only make this a regulatory point of view. So it's not just compliance. This is really about future-proofing your business, also from a commercial point of view.
Yeah, definitely. That's super exciting about the new developments. That's definitely going to be a whirlwind to explore.
Absolutely.
And I think the brands that you work with as well, it'll be a great lesson for all of us. But I also definitely agree with Positive Luxury's perspective. We also always kind of step one encourage the brands to understand where their impacts are, where their dependencies are. Let's focus on that first, so that we're focusing our time, our energy, our resources on the right topics. Because I think with everything to do with sustainability, it can sometimes get a little bit out of hand, and you can get a bit excited and or overwhelmed. So yeah, definitely having that data to first understand, okay, what should we look at? Definitely.
Exactly. And sorry if I may to add, indeed, like data is one thing. It's very much about what you do with that data and what you make out of the data. So it's turning data into information. And that's for sure what Positive Luxury does, making sure that you can really have that conversation and help your clients to understand what is their specific next step.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that. So challenge number 3 is, of course, policy pressure. We do need to discuss it slightly. We can't avoid it. At the summit, although the message about, regulation was slightly uncertain, it's still very much focused on the fact that regulation still does continue to accelerate. So whether it is CSRD or EPR or DPPs, brands can no longer afford to be caught off guard. And as Jolanda, you already kind of started mentioning, is that there's always opportunity here. So regulation, when approached proactively, can also drive competitive advantage. And Jolanda, I'll go straight to you again for this one. So tex.tracer is right at the heart of this. How are you helping your clients prepare for incoming legislation, like, for example, the DPP, the Digital Product Passport, and where do you see the biggest misconceptions for this?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd love to continue then on to what I just mentioned, where I started. So basically we start with, I'd like to say that the tedious job is collecting and verifying supply chain data, so that our clients have the data which they can turn into information to actually make decisions and act to basically improve their emissions, social standards in the supply chain, and improve their collections going forward. And then for us, it's more and more about, yes, for sure, we'll make sure that we help clients to comply. We'll keep an eye out on what's happening in regulations. But at the same time, we'd like to really move beyond that and say, then it's very much about creating a return on investment. So look at it from a commercial perspective. How can you future-proof your business by utilizing this data to your benefit? And it sounds, definitely I started tex.tracer from really an impact-driven mission. And that's still there, but I've come to realize as well that only being focused on impact is not going to help us, because if you go too much onto that, it's not sustainable at all, because often that company will not be sustainable in a commercial way. So it has to be that combination of utilizing sustainable data and sustainability and circularity for the better also in a commercial, from a commercial perspective. And that, again, is also a personalized approach. And this is where I'd hope definitely Positive Luxury will help as well, is in trying to understand what, for instance, the digital product passport can bring on a commercial level. And this is where I'm definitely of the opinion that the digital product passport should be much more seen as a new e-com channel, where you can have continuous conversation and relationship with the consumer, and try to create this longer product life, extended life cycle, and create value throughout that life cycle by indeed looking at the repair, resell, and more options. And sorry, so and the biggest misconceptions is then also like it's a misconception to only look at it from a from a compliance perspective.
Compliance perspective. Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with that with the digital product passport. I almost feel like the kind of minimum requirements or the compliance side of things, that should just be second nature. We should have that information anyway. It's in there. We've got it. And then where the opportunity and the kind of competitive advantage comes from is that resale, the customer journey. How can you keep it going? I'm excited to see how the industry kind of tackles that. And it's obviously going to have some challenges at the beginning, but in the long run, I think there is definitely a lot of opportunity from all sides of the business. And Amy, from your kind of advisory work, how should brands navigate the alphabet soup of climate and ESG legislation without getting overwhelmed? As in, even when I started this first slide, what did I say? I said CSRD, DPP, all these, all this kind of alphabet soup. So, what would be your take on this?
I think it's a brilliant question. And if there's anyone in the audience that's joined us that works in the sustainability team that's navigating this, I absolutely take my hats off to you, because the way that it's been changing over the last, say, even 6 months, day to day, is definitely, it's really tricky to navigate. I think it's, as we've said in this conversation already, it's like looking way beyond the bare minimum of what's kind of stated in some of these regulations. I would definitely say, like, let's look to the ambition of pre-omnibus versions of some of this legislation as well. I think that's a great start, like kind of using that as like a baseline. I would say in terms of frameworks and principles and recommendations, of course, the UNFCCC, the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action, I think, is brilliant, especially for science-based targets when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions reduction across scopes 1 to 3, and aligning that within what some might have now ruled out, but the 1.5 degree threshold. I think that's really important. Also, what many of the brands are doing in terms of like coal phase out, I think that's a great sort of framework to follow for those elements. I would also say looking at the global biodiversity framework with all the targets that it cover, various things from chemicals to water, indigenous peoples, things like that. Of course, for nature as well, thinking about science-based targets for nature, and the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures are brilliant guidelines. I would also say looking way beyond where legislation is at the moment and thinking really long term about things like climate adaptation. Climate adaptation isn't written into the Fashion Industry Charter at the moment, but of course we know that it's really critical when thinking about how we're going to protect vulnerable communities working across fashion supply chains. Some recommendations for reading on that, and just talking about the various supportive procurement policies and health and safety measures in place for climate adaptation for workers within a given supply chain. I would say look to the Ethical Trading Initiative, the Laudes Foundation, and the H&M Foundation. It did a brilliant report on this as well. And then there's also tying in research from Cornell University, and Jason Judd was actually speaking at GFS as well. So some great recommendations there. I would also say the New Climate Institute, which doesn't focus specifically on fashion, but across multiple sectors, has lots of different tools that I'd recommend, and you can play around with country, like context specific challenges, and sort of like get to grips with that. So some interesting examples there. And then on the legislation piece as well, I guess my other thing would be to say, don't underestimate the power of advocacy as well. As like within this, of course, we can follow what's in the rules, but how are we using our voices or corporate voices outside of that? And also perhaps looking to the aggressive of ambition of some campaign groups as well. Like, what are they calling for? Like, how can we align like what the business targets are, what businesses are currently doing over the next 5 to 10 years with the calls from campaigners, because they're obviously very ambitious, and I think it's great to kind of meet them there as well.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thank you. So that kind of, to me, that almost sounds like there's obviously so many resources out there and different legislation coming up, but it's also about finding the right resources for you and for your business. And I think from a positive luxury perspective, legislation, to me, what I almost see it as and try to like help clients with is it's a framework to follow. Let's start with that. It gives you guidance, it gives you somewhere to start, it gives you somewhere to keep going, and it's all so interconnected to your business model as a whole. So instead of just looking at it as a legislation that you need to be compliant for, let's start maybe by what can you use, what can we get out of it, even from a people management perspective with your employees? Is it, about policies, about processes? Let's take it step by step, and then obviously when you do that, you build that compliance within that journey. Right, I'm just looking at the time, so we're gonna kind of move forward to our kind of final section, a bit of a conclusion. The fashion industry is, starting to realize that shared challenges required also shared solutions, and I think that's why we're also here today. So kind of to both of you, how do you see collaboration evolving? Where can brands work together more openly? And where do we still face barriers between that collaboration versus competition?
You want to start, Amy? I guess that, yeah, you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So I think when it comes to collaboration, I guess it's with brands and manufacturers and their supply base. I think it's about like that continuous dialogue and positive feedback loop. These suppliers and manufacturers have really tricky mandates now, whether that's on energy efficiency, renewable energy adoption, thinking about all those things, and not like reprimanding them and cutting them off because they haven't met a certain score or grade or something like that, but working with them to improve. So I think that's one really important area of collaboration. I guess on the environmental sort of like decarbonization side as well, the collaboration that happens between brands to be transparent about their shared manufacturers is really important, so they can both, or however many are involved, help them decarbonize and invest to help them transition to different thermal energy sources and things like that. So I think that's a really important area of collaboration between competitors, that we could say. And then I also think, of course, co-creating and collaborating with those in the global south. So, and also at the same time, I also wanted to spotlight this because I think it's a brilliant part of the GFS is they have the next gen assembly. So incorporating those intergenerational voices into the conversations and collaborating with people in that regard to get outsider perspective. So those are a few things that I have in mind for collaboration.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think it's so nice that you're mentioning that the dialogue from brands with their suppliers. I think it's an often heard part also at Global Fashion Summit. Do suppliers get a seat at the table? Is that enough? I have to say, I guess so far, maybe the answer is no. Remember Milan Ali from the IAF a couple of years ago even voicing that out as he was on the main stage at Global Fashion Summit. And I'd hope that that was maybe a trigger to have more suppliers on stage. Unfortunately, I think we're still not there, but of course, steps are being taken. Also for us as a solution provider, it's one of the things that we regard very highly, and it's super important for us to really take into consideration the voice of the suppliers, because it's really there where real change is happening. And yes, they need to be motivated and stimulated by the brands, but in the end, it needs to happen there. And actually to enable them to take next steps in an easy manner. It's not just for brands and retailers to collaborate, but it's also for solution providers like us popping up to collaborate. So that's where I'd love to share with you as well that we're now tomorrow official launch, but today I'll bring it out here then as well in the webinar, is that we have defined the first outlines of a global data sharing platform together with our competitors, and that we hope to launch a global data sharing platform in the next few years. This is not next few months, but it will take years. But we think it's super important to work on that, because we need to make it as simple as possible for suppliers to actually communicate details. And we don't want them to log in multiple times and share data multiple times like they have been doing with social audits. And with the audit fatigue, we want to avoid now also transparency fatigue. So hopefully that's also going to help suppliers and therefore also the brands. And that from there, we can, for instance, also create marketplaces almost. That's how we see it, where brands and suppliers can meet each other and actually find out how they can take joint actions. And they will indeed be able to see which suppliers are working with which brands and to jointly take the next steps there.
That is amazing. That's actually very exciting to hear. I'm just straight away thinking about it. Of course, from our client base perspective, I think that is fantastic to know that there is this movement happening in sharing that data, because exactly like you said, we see a lot of those great tech solutions and kind of fall into the competitor space, but that's not what we want.
No, exactly. I think we all, looking at our the transparency space, there are so many wonderful solutions, but I think we all cater to different markets. tex.tracer has even released a new playbook last week at GFS, and with 172 data points. We have those data points in our platform as well. So it's now really about making sure that we harmonize the input in those data fields to really make sure that we can just move that data easily, share it without difficulty.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And then finally, kind of, first of all, thank you so much for the time that you've taken today, Jolanda and Amy. And it's been super nice to look back at the themes from last week and hear your perspectives and on kind of the challenges and opportunities. But one kind of final question for you today is that what do you think was missing from this year's summit? And is there anything specific that you would like to see more of next year? Jolanda, you kind of started on that a little bit.
I started off already, I think, with the suppliers. So that's definitely one thing for me. Well, the other thing is that I think, we're a lot of focus at GFS is on large, often luxury brands, and explaining their pilot projects, which is fantastic, really great and innovative solutions we're seeing there. At the same time, yes, some smaller brands are showcased as well, but how can we maybe learn even more from those smaller brands? Because often they're the true innovators. And yes, maybe that's not yet at scale, but that by giving them a stage at Global Fashion Summit, we could make sure that those larger companies could then scale that kind of innovative ideas. So that's where I'd love to see more next year.
Anything from you, Amy, specifically?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a little bit more of something that I actually loved in the interludes of some of the sections. Was Nadir interviewed the gentleman who runs the catering company for the summit, and thinking about all the ways the food company reduces waste, manages to reuse materials, like all these different things. And I think like cross-sector collaboration is so important, and exploring that. And I guess our session on farm to fashion, which looked at how regeneratively grown dent corn is being used to create renewable feedstock for a new type of bio-derived lycra, is a really interesting example. So like, what lessons can we learn from different industries? I'd love to dive more into.
Yeah, amazing. I agree with everything that you have said, and especially with the kind of giving hopefully a bit more of a voice to those small and medium businesses. I think that's what we work at Positive Luxury with so many wonderful companies who are taking a lot of initiative, and I think it would be great to have a bit more space and a bit more vulnerability for those companies at such a great event like the GFS. You know, it's a fantastic establishment, and a yearly, event that everyone looks out for. Even if you're not there in person, you look at the conversations that go in before and after. So we need to take advantage of that. But thank you so much for today. I'm just going to now see if we've got any kind of questions in the Q&A chat. If you are still on the webinar and have some questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. I know that we have one, which is for you, Jolanda. So on the global data you mentioned, will data be also taken from Africa?
Well, the global data sharing will be basically connecting suppliers to a platform and to brands and retailers, or whoever would want to receive data. So definitely throughout the world. So that will include Africa. And if you actually mean, Cami, maybe the geospatial data, also there, I guess it can be worldwide. But definitely. So Cami, if you want to talk more about that, lovely to connect. And thanks for your question.
Do we have any other questions? I don't think so right now, but that's okay. There's always more time. So I'm gonna close this off for now. So just a kind of final bit to say from my side of things, at Positive Luxury, we really believe that sustainability and profitability go hand in hand, and I'm glad that kind of came up in the conversation today as well, thinking about the competitive advantage, the commercial side of things. And if today's conversation sparked any questions or ideas or any areas where you might want to chat more or need support in, we'd love to continue the dialogue. You'll receive we'll have the recording of this webinar with also some contact informations for Amy and Jolanda and myself. So please do reach out. We're here to help you and support you and continue this conversation. Thank you so much, Amy and Jolanda, for your time, and for everyone who joined us, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Take care.
Likewise.
Take care.
Bye-bye.